I'm meant to be giving you inspiring stories about how to fix the world food system. And I will do that, but only after I explain why it's broken, which means giving you some very uninspiring stories for about half an hour. So strap in and be prepared to be mortified and horrified at the state of the global food system, because it's deeply broken. And there was a story that happened in 2010 that sort of outlined quite how fundamentally broken the system is. And so I want to start with that story and then move on to some of the options that we have in terms of to fix the global food system. And then actually I want to share at least one story from the documentary that I'm making at the moment with Steve James. Steve's an amazing director, he did Hoop Dreams, and now we're working on this documentary called Generation Food. And since this is the last engagement I'm going to do until that film comes out, as far as I know, I want to do a little bit of a preview just to sort of see what you think. And get your thoughts on some of these solutions. But first, the shitty bit. So here's the story. And appropriately enough, on a night like this, the story that I want to tell begins with a fire. The fire starts in Russia, and it starts what's left of a forest near some of the biggest wheat fields on Earth. Now, this happens because Russia was having a once-in-a-100-year heat wave. So this is a story that starts. It's about climate change because, as you know, these once-in-a-100-year phenomena seem to be happening once every couple of years. So we start with a once-in-a-100-year heat wave and a fire in Russia. Now, it starts because the government has sold off some of the forest to loggers, and the logging companies trying to return a profit, and so they clear cut and they don't worry about the brush that's left behind. So there's a tinderbox, and that brush, that fire spreads to the fields of wheat. And the wheat is, it's important to understand that Russia in 2010 was doing like what a lot of governments were doing in 2010, which was cutting its government budget. It was undergoing austerity. So one of the things that the government cut was money for firefighting. So we have a fire and we have fewer firefighters. And so now Russian grain fields are ablaze. And what's interesting here is that Russia faces a problem. It's Russia, the world's third largest wheat exporter. And Russians want to eat their daily bread, and the Russian government has some sort of commitment to make sure that Russians are fed. And enter at this stage a company that you may be familiar with. It's a company called Glencore. Glencore is one of the world's largest mining companies, but as a sort of side, they also do agriculture. Now, when Glencore does agriculture, it does it in a fairly big way. I mean, Glencore controls 25% of the global barley market. Glencore is one of the companies that profited handsomely from the Canadian grain, the wheat board privatization, because Viterra, which is, as you'll be familiar with, one of the large companies here that controls shipping on the West Coast, profited, I believe, to a tune of $100 million a year as a result of this grain board privatization, and Glencore recently bought that. So Glencore, very powerful company with interests in wheat. And Glencore says to the Russian government, and this is a meeting that happens apparently in Switzerland, it says to the Russian government, here's an opportunity for you. You could continue selling your wheat on the global market, but there will be Russians who will be priced out of the market if you do that. So why not have a grain export ban? And that way, obviously a lot of your wheat is on fire, but what's left, you can use that to make bread, and then the Russians, your population will have cheap bread, and you won't be you won't be victim to some of the food rebellions that have been happening because of high food prices. And wouldn't you, Russian government, like to have a population that wasn't rising up against it? The Russian government, for whatever reason, we don't know whether it was because of the meeting with Glencore or because it was genuinely concerned with reducing the cost of bread for Russians, the Russian government institutes an export ban. So, and for Russians this works out quite well, because then the price of bread remains fairly stable and Russians get to eat. The trouble is that Russia is the third largest wheat exporter on Earth. And so when Russia starts withholding its grain, that has repercussions for the rest of the planet. It also has repercussions for Glencore. I mean, there are a few traders who, because they, allegedly, there was an opportunity for them to see this coming, they would have made a lot of money because the price of wheat went up by 15% in 2 days. Right? And you can see the dynamic here, right? Russia, third largest exporter, suddenly saying, oh, this is all ours now, you can't have it. And at that moment, the global grain market now starts looking for alternatives to be able to make sure that there is enough wheat for the people who can afford it. And that's the moment where the price goes up. And if you know that curve is coming, you can see that spike coming, you can make a lot of money. Of course, there are other people in Glencore who weren't privy to that meeting, and so since their job was to buy global grain, they were chasing that curve up. And so Glencore came out of this in a mixed way, even though a few of the traders did rather well and went home with rather fat bonuses. But so now we're in a situation where the global wheat market's gone up, the global wheat price has gone up by 15%, and that means that countries that are importing wheat have to pay more for it. And one of those countries is Mozambique. Mozambique is a country what's Mozambique doing importing bread? Wheat is not, it doesn't grow particularly well in Mozambique. But the reason Mozambique and Mozambicans have a predilection for bread is because of food culture that was imposed on them through colonialism. The reason that Mozambicans want bread is because they were colonized by the Portuguese, and that history of colonization has been sedimented into the food culture. It's there as part of the food culture. So now, as part of colonialism, as part of the dividend of colonialism, Mozambicans want bread. And the trouble is that they are poor. So 60% of the average Mozambican's daily expenditure is on food. 60% of your daily expenditure on food. And the price of that's just gone through the roof. And so the government wasn't able to buy more wheat, and there were food rebellions in the street. People took to the street, demanding that the Mozambican government make bread available. And the government didn't have any money, it didn't have the political resources, it didn't have grain stores, it was hostage to the global market, and so there was nothing the government could do but to suppress the violence, which they did using rubber bullets. And then this comes from an official government statement, they ran out of rubber bullets and had to use live ammunition. And so over a dozen people were killed in these bread riots, in these food rebellions demanding change. So let's tell that story again, but now introduce the cultures that are there. I mean, first of all, this is a story about climate change. But climate change, as we experience climate change is never and never will be just the weather. It's always our social response to it and the social context in which it happens. So, for example, in Russia, what was climate change was not just the fact that it was a once-in-a-100-year heat wave, but also the austerity and the clear-cutting. That's the package of climate change. But the package of climate change isn't just that, it's also the market culture that articulates a country that has transformed large parts of its land into a monoculture, which is another kind of culture, a monoculture, linking that to a global market and a global wheat market that then feeds into another culture, a food culture that's been imposed by colonialism and by imperialism. And then on top of that, a government culture where the government is ready to resort to violence to quell its citizens because it has no other resources at its disposal. So you have a number of competing cultures there, and it's important to sort of take a step back and say, well, where do these come from? And one of the, I think it's important to understand this, the global wheat culture, the global culture of export, because it's not natural. There's nothing normal about that. And I've written about this elsewhere, but I think it's worth rehearsing very quickly why it is that there is a global wheat market. The global wheat market is only 140 years old. It's historically, it's a really weird thing to have a global market in wheat. And you can trace its origins to the British, when the British colonized India. Before the British came to India, India had a different food culture and a different culture of entitlement and access to food. India was a feudal economy. Now this, to say a different culture isn't necessarily to say a better culture. I mean, if you're in India in a feudal economy and you're a peasant, it's shitty. Because what happens is you are working on land that's owned by a landlord, and you are toiling away, and the landlord will take away your surplus and give you just enough to survive. There's nothing great about that. except when there is a drought or a famine, or the crops fail, or pests come, or whatever it is. When there is a disaster, when there is a shortage of food, the only silver lining on the dark cloud of feudalism is that the landlord has a responsibility to feed the peasant. It's what's called a moral economy, right? So there is this culture of no one, even though feudalism is awful and it involves the concentration of power in just a very few hands, there is this idea that no one should go hungry in this economy. And the British came, and the British were very keen to have a global wheat market because they saw in the Punjab a grain basket that would be able to provide cheap wheat, particularly for workers in Manchester and Liverpool and London. And cheap bread would be something that the British were keen to have. And the British saw feudal landlords giving away free food, and they said, landlord, you don't need to give away free food. We, the British, have a much better system. This system involves you paying your workers, you pay them cash, but then instead of you giving away food when there is a shortage, they'll just buy it. And we, the British, will also buy your food, and we will pay more than you've ever imagined, and you'll be able to grow more grain than you ever have in human history. It'll be fantastic. You'll love it. And the feudal landlords said, oh, thanks, we're fine. And the British said, no, we have guns. And so it was. That's an abbreviated history. You get the idea. And the idea is that actually through this market mechanism, the cultures around food and entitlement were dramatically changed. And in a sense, of course, the British didn't lie. As a result of these market mechanisms, more food was produced per person than ever before in India's history. There was vast amounts of food being exported by India at the end of the 19th century. And the historian Mike Davis sort of charts this in a fantastic book called Late Victorian Holocausts, which, despite the title, it's an incredible read. And what he observes is the corollary of this massive export of food, which is that there's more hunger in India than ever before. And the statistic that Mike Davis gives is kind of galling, which is that in the 2,000 years before the British came to India, there was a famine once every 120 years. Again, imagine you're in your time machine and you're going back to feudal India and you see a famine. You'd be unlucky, because then you'd have to wait over a century to see another famine. But after the British came, and after India was exporting more grain than ever before, Indians were experiencing a famine once every 4 years, with the irregularity of an election cycle. And that I think is telling to understanding what's broken about the food system today. Well, there's actually a great deal of food being produced. We have more food, we have more calories per person than ever before in human history. Per person. But the trouble is that we distribute food through the market, and that means that if you are rich, then you get to have food, but if you are poor, you starve. And of course, we now live in this world of stuffed and starved, where if you are poor in a rich country, you're likely to be overweight. There's a correlation between being overweight in a rich country and being poor. Now, it's important to understand that sort of global wheat system about where it came from. It came through colonialism, it came through violence, and in some senses it yields this massive dividend in terms of food, but it also produces hunger because of the market culture that accompanies it. But beyond that, it's important to see that this isn't just an artifact of colonialism. It is alive and well today, and it is being pushed you can see its effects in India, for example. India today has a range of sort of phenomena associated with this sort of push for free markets above all else. India is the country with epidemic levels of farmer suicide. As many of you are aware, that when the government opens up its economy to the free market and shrinks its commitment to the rural areas, levels of suicide have gone up because debt drives farmers to despair. Farmers are more likely to be indebted, and when the government takes a step back, the most powerful person that a farmer has contact with is sometimes likely to be the moneylender, who's also the seed provider, who's also the middleman for buying products. So when you concentrate that amount of power in one hand, farmers are more likely to get into debt and more likely to despair. But India is also home to high levels of people who are malnourished. When I was growing up, my parents said, eat up, there are children starving in Africa. But what do you think African parents tell their children? In South Africa, what do they tell their kids? In South Africa, they say, eat up, there are children starving in India. And that's true. There are more children starving in India than there are in Africa. And so India, and the levels of hunger in India, according to some estimates, are going up. Despite the government sort of gerrymandering the figures, there's now, in some areas, more hunger than there was under the British. And at the same time, India is home to the world's largest number of, until one year, there were 4 of the top 10 richest people on Earth. They were all men. 4 of the top 10 richest men on Earth, according to the Forbes billionaires. 4 of those top 10 were Indian. India is home to the world's largest private residence, the most expensive private residence. It's called Antilla. It's a $1.3 billion tower block in downtown Bombay. It's a staff of 600 people, helipad, multi-level garage, staff of 600 to care for a family of 4. And at the feet of that family, you will find a city where levels of type 2 diabetes are epidemic. The largest number of people with type 2 diabetes is now in India. 20% of people in some southern Indian cities have type 2 diabetes. So that's, that gives you a sense of sort of the long-term consequences of sort of food culture, letting corporations in. The diabetes story is interesting. You may know that until 1990, when India liberalized its economy, India didn't have Coke or Pepsi. It just had Thumbs Up. If any of you tried Thumbs Up, a local brand of Coke. And in 1990, with the liberalization of the economy, with the government taking a step back from its hunger programs and from its rural programs. Instead, it was only in big capital, so that's why we have these billionaires in India. And at the same time, India was opening up its doors to Coke and Pepsi. So Coke and Pepsi come in, and they market fairly aggressively to Indians. And Coke comes in with their global Coke advert. If you've seen the global Coke advert that actually is still the global Coke advert, which is about polar bears. The polar bears advert of polar bears waddling along, and they lob off the top of the bottle of Coke, and then Coke. And so this is, for those of you unfamiliar with Indian cultural iconography, polar bears are not big in India. Watching the northern lights doesn't happen too often. Or then you're being on the equator. So you have 1 billion people watching this going, what the fuck's that? On the other hand, Pepsi come in with the Bollywood A-list. And so for them it's like Pepsi, that's more vaudeville, but you get the idea, it's like the end of Slumdog Millionaire, but with Pepsi. And what's interesting about that is that actually you have a sort of titanic struggle between Coke and Pepsi, and the losers are Indians. Because you have a food culture now that's been imported, that's been dumped and heavily marketed. And the result of it is, as I say, epidemic levels of type 2 diabetes, and in some cities, diabetes rates are 20%, even in the slums. Just in case you're thinking, well, it's only about people rich enough to be able to afford this. The widespread availability of sugary drinks and of Pepsi and Coke's products mean that in one survey, diabetes rates in slums was about 13%. And that contrasts with in rural areas of being around about 3%. Now that's, that food culture being imported and dropped in is horrific. But in some ways, we are part of it here. Because we may think, well, look, we're gonna fight this. We're gonna, we're gonna try and back away from this kind of food culture by going into our local supermarket, and when we're there, we're gonna buy something that says fair trade and shade grown, and organic, and dolphin compatible, tuna pro-locust, and all the rest of it. And all of a sudden, the trouble with that is that when you step into a supermarket, you're at the food system's ground zero. Some of the most powerful corporations in the food system today are supermarkets. Now the trouble with this, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with shopping smart. I buy fair trade coffee because what's the alternative? Bastard coffee. Right? Buy coffee that involves exploiting children. I would like blood on my beans. But right there, we point to the sort of paradox of sort of ethical consumerism, which is that you are still operating within a paradigm in which you, the consumer, set the terms of the engagement. Fair trade is about giving a few more crumbs from the table to groups around the world who have been historically exploited and colonized. And how we make up for that by making sure that people are able to hang on by their fingernails in the world of whether it's coffee or chocolate or bananas or whatever it is. But the trouble is that we are so imbued in this culture that it's very hard to step out. And you can't shop your way out of this because the forces that construct us and construct our food culture are far more powerful than shopping can alleviate. And I mean, if that sounds a little sort of hyperbolic, let me give you an example from where I stand now, the moral low ground here. I want to suggest to you that the kind of food culture that we are part of constructs us in ways that have damaged us. And the way that I want to think about that is through personal experience of the beverage that got me through my PhD. Now, my PhD wasn't officially sponsored by Red Bull, but it might as well. Red Bull, many of your students here, you will know that Red Bull is marketed to you, because if you've seen the Red Bull advert, there's this undergraduate who's faced with the problem of either completing his term paper or making out with his girlfriend. And it turns out if he drinks Red Bull, he can do both. But Red Bull is a long line, the latest in a long line of beverages that is meant to help us get through the working day. I mean, tea, obviously, was the first of these beverages. A beverage that's designed to have calories and caffeine to be able to help workers make it through the day, but without too much concern about their nutrition. Red Bull is like that. But Red Bull is weirder, because if you're trying to explain the ingredients in Red Bull to your great-grandparent, if we're trying to follow Michael Pollan's rule here, explain to try and eat stuff that your great-grandparent would eat. So you're trying to explain to your great-grandparent what's in Red Bull. So you look at the label and it's like, well, this is water. People often know what that is. Water, sugar, high fructose corn syrup. Basically, you could often, sometimes, occasionally sugar, and then caffeine, and then a bunch of amino acids, taurine, creatine, what have you. Now, these amino acids are often found in our own urine. These are metabolites. We can find taurine and creatine in our wee. And so if you're trying to explain to your great-grandparent, look, here's a beverage that'll keep you up and it'll give you wings and it's terrific. And your great-grandparent, well, I used to drink tea, I understand the principle here. So what's inside? Well, it's water and caffeine and high fructose corn syrup. Well, it's kind of like sugar. And piss! If you try to explain that to your great-grandparent, I think questions would be asked. And yet that's become normal, right? It's normal for us to be drinking. It's certainly normal for me to drink that because you need it every hour that God sent to be able to get things done and then run from one place to another. But the politics of that kind of beverage choice are the politics that surround us the minute we step into a supermarket. Because when you step into a supermarket, you're entering these highly effective machines to make you buy stuff. If you think of a supermarket not as a place where you buy food, but as a machine that makes you buy stuff, then first of all, you're much better prepared to actually survive that experience. But you're also in a better position to understand one of the greatest tricks that's been pulled on us in the modern food system. And this is the greatest cultural trick that's been pulled, where you step into a supermarket and you think all the food is there for you. All the food has been made just for you. And yet, the supermarket itself is designed to make you consume more. The milk is always at the back. There's the smell of baking bread to make you buy more stuff. The music is carefully calibrated to make you buy junk food. And everything about this supermarket is geared to make you buy stuff you don't need. But this is the deepest trick of the global food system, is that although we think the food is made for us, in every way that matters, we are made for our food. Although we think the food is made for us, we have been transformed into the kinds of people who think that a trip to the supermarket and reaching for Red Bull and all the other sort of even the fresh food sections of these towers of perfectly spherical red tomatoes, no matter what time of year, and no matter that they taste mostly like water. These are the kinds of things that constitute the way in which we feed ourselves. That food culture has come to make us. And so the interesting and the important question is, how do we unmake that? How do we unmake a food culture? How do we rebuild a food culture that has been so violently, that has been so integral to who we are, that we have forgotten about food? We have forgotten about the provenance of food, the culture of food, the taste of food, the politics of food. And instead, what we've been told is not only is this food here for us, but it is convenient. And the convenience, and so all of a sudden it fits into our busy modern lifestyle of running from one place to another. It's convenient that we get to eat this food on our lap. It's convenient that this food tastes good and is high in salt and fat and sugar. They're the kinds of things that make us want to eat more of it, even though the consequences of following this kind of diet is killing us. So how do we undo that? Well, there's an organization that I quite like. And this is where the inspiring stories start. So let's move on from the doom and gloom. Right? I like an organization called Slow Food. Have people heard of Slow Food? If you haven't, if you haven't heard of it at least vaguely, you may have heard of it as a kind of circle jerk of olive oil fanciers and red wine. Because it's Slow Food in its worst moments, and I'm leading with this because it's important to get to the best, but in its worst moments, it's a kind of middle class, like, sort of quaffing and sniffing stuff. But actually, there's something very radical about Slow Food, which is that it takes pleasure seriously. And taking pleasure and joy seriously means that there's a bunch of Italians who take joy and pleasure seriously. But they also take their policies seriously, and their politics seriously. And so they want to know, well, look, what is it that you need to be able to fight back against fast food? What is it you need to be able to have pleasure? And not only for rich people to have pleasure, but for everyone to have pleasure. What is it that you need to do that? Well, you need time and you need money. So how do you get more time and money? That's the interesting problem in the global food. How do you get more time and money? Well, Slow Food tackled this by organizing, unionizing the poorest workers in Italy, who are farm workers. So they raise the wages so that the poorest people get to eat more food and get to pay what food is worth, but still have more money left in their pockets at the end of the day. And then on top of that, they organize a 2-hour lunch break in order to be able to make sure that the food is, that you can enjoy the food, that you're not rushing and eating food off your lap, but that you're able to savor food properly, as it is meant to be eaten, and savor it collectively. Now, I love that idea of unionizing and fighting for time back from our global food system, because that is what has been taken away from us, right? When you go to the supermarket, what is it that you're losing? You're losing first a sense of where you are, right? These tomatoes, these bananas, the counter-seasonal fruit flown from Peru, all of this, it gives you no sense at all of where you are. A supermarket here looks like the same as a supermarket in Toronto, looks the same as a supermarket in London. These have become totally delocalized places. You have no idea when you are either, right? You have no idea what's in season. All you have is these various kinds of different colored vegetables and fruits that taste basically like water. And so instead, we're now moving into what Slow Food does is push back on that. And I like that idea, because not only are they insisting on the importance of pleasure, but they're also insisting on the importance of raising wages. Because at the end of the day, hunger is not a shortage of food. We have, as I say, more food than ever before. The way that you fight hunger is not by just growing more stuff for the sake of it, but instead making sure that people can afford stuff. Now that's an important part of a culture of sustainability and a culture of food that is vital for us to recognize if we're to make sure that everyone gets to eat. But if we're interested in everyone getting to eat, then I want to tell you the story from Malawi, and actually then the fun stuff. We do sort of more Q&A, that's where the meat of this kind of engagement is important. But I do want to tell you the story from Malawi, which is, we've just been filming there, and Malawi is a country that is very poor. It is a tobacco exporting country, and the tobacco market is doing very well. Malawi doesn't really export anything else, so all its dollar reserves come basically from tourism or tobacco. And Malawi did something that struck me as fairly sensible, which is that they decided not to follow international development advice, but instead they decided they wanted to spend money to raise, to actually invest in their farms. And international development advice for a very long time was, look, screw agriculture. What we need is industrial development and money in the cities, and agriculture will take care of itself. And only recently, organisations like the World Bank started to address that. If anyone has a question about the World Bank, I'd be very happy to talk about that. But in the meantime, so Malawi starts, and this is in 2008. Malawi buys fertilizer, and this seems like between 2008 and 2009, yields of corn doubled. So this looks like it was a good investment, right? In 2008, Malawi buys fertilizer. 2009, they got double the amount of corn. And actually, the main reason that the corn harvest doubled is because the rains came. And the rains have been coming on time in Malawi. In 2008, 2009, from not having come to the level that was fairly low, the rains came on time. So there was a sudden jump. And some people have attributed, to say that that's because of the fertilizer thing. But actually, the fertilizer caused about 15% of that jump, and the rest of it was because the rains came on time. The trouble is, Malawi in 2008 bought fertilizer, and you will remember in 2008 that there was this global food crisis. And in the global food crisis, what agricultural commodity had the highest price rise? Fertilizer. The price of fertilizer went up by 250%. So here's Malawi, a dirt poor country, and it just spent all its dollar reserves on fertilizer. And it gave away the fertilizer, and now Malawi's broke. Malawi doesn't have money for things like petrol, for gasoline. So there are riots in Lilongwe around the government's inability, rebellions, uprisings, demanding that the government change, address the deficit. And unfortunately, this fertilizer-driven agriculture hasn't fared well. And now we're in the middle of hunger season in Malawi, which is that time of year between when the money runs out from the last season and when harvests come in the next season. Harvesting will start in a couple of months' time. This is the hunger season in Malawi, and in southern Malawi, things are looking pretty bad. But in northern Malawi, there's a fantastic series of experiments going on due to the work in part of the Canadian academic Rachel Besner-Kerr, who's working with a group there. And this started about 15 years ago, and they started at a hospital, and they wanted to fight infant malnutrition. They wanted to make sure that children weren't coming in hungry. Now, Malawi, again, not a rich country. I mean, life expectancy in Malawi is 52. 12% of the population are living with AIDS. And when you have that kind of, where you have the AIDS epidemic biting full force, you absolutely need to eat well. And that means that if you're interested in combating malnutrition, you need to move people away from just eating maize, just eating corn, and to start diversifying things. And so this program develops out of the hospital and starts reaching out to farmers. So we have 5,000 farmers who are then recruited to this program, who start experimenting with different ways of growing food. And they don't have access to fertilizer, they don't have access to external inputs. So they're trying to figure out new ways of farming. And they develop a polyculture, not a monoculture, but a polyculture, a different way of farming that's not about sort of one crop. But instead you're growing sorghum next to millet, next to leguminous trees that fix nitrogen in the soil and then provide shade cover. And that sounds a bit weird, right? If you think about farming, you think, well, what farmers want is sun. You don't want shade as a farmer. If you're a farmer, you're interested in having sun. But why does shade matter? Well, this is because of climate change. In Malawi, particularly in the north, in this village of Wagwa, the sun, the extremes of climate get too bad for photosynthesis to work. Photosynthesis stops at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So after that, that's too much sun. And they discovered that a 15% increase in shade cover leads to 15% increase in yields. And they're also, as I say, they're fertilizing the soil, they're growing plants that attract beneficial insects, and they're doing a range of fantastic things that allow more food to be produced than under conventional agriculture. And depending on the year, between 10 and 20% more food comes out of this polyculture than comes out of industrial agriculture. So that seems to me a fantastic win. Except, now here's a challenge for you. Have a guess if you know, hold your peace, but if you don't know, have a guess. Here's a little conundrum. How is it that you can have more food in the fields, more food, and at the same time you can have increased child malnutrition? More food in the fields over here, but increased child malnutrition over there. How's that happen? There's a phone that knows. Yes. It's a distribution problem, meaning... No, it's not that you can't get the food where it's needed over here to where it's growing here to where it's needed over here, because often these are small patches of land that families own, and often they'll walk half a mile or something to get to it. But that's all. It's not an insurmountable distance. At the back.
It's the root of the market-driven capitalist system.
Capitalism would be, but actually it's not about capitalism. But it's actually, because this is a system where no money changes hands. In this particular village, the food is grown for domestic consumption. Matter.
Because women are in the fields and they're not nursing their children.
That's right, that's the answer. The answer is that harvesting is women's work. But harvesting is not only women's work. Women's work also involves cooking and cleaning and fetching water and firewood and breastfeeding. So if there's more harvesting to do, then the amount of cooking is going to be the same, then what is it that goes down? It's breastfeeding. So how do you fix that? How do you fix that? Make the men cook. So no, and this is what the villagers, men and women in the village who are part of this program, who are trying to eradicate infant malnutrition. That's what they said. They said, look, we need more men to cook. How do you do that? Stop the Canadians. Cooking classes, thank you. So that's what they try. No. So that's what they do. They do a kind of food network approach, but again without electricity. So they bring a cook, and these are farmers who are peers, and they come in, but they come with a cook and a nutritionist, and the cook will be like, gentlemen of the house, here's a pot. You may have seen one of these before. And here's us throwing some stuff in, firewood and all this sort of stuff. And we're going to heat it up, and look, it tastes delicious, doesn't it? Oh, yeah, it tastes very good. So here it is. Now you know how to cook. We'll see you later. Oddly, that didn't work. In the same way that the Food Network doesn't work. The Food Network. As many of you know, there's a terrific book called "Short History of the American Stomach," and what the Food Network. In this book, Fred Kaufman, the author of that, has a moment where he shows the Food Network to a porn producer. And the porn producer comes back after 24 hours, a little irked, and she says, look, they've stolen everything that we know. Everything from the over-mic'd sound, to the blown-out colour, to even when you take when you take the tray out of the oven, there's a top-down shot of things saying, apparently that's called the money shot. And the thing about the Food Network is that most people who watch the Food Network don't cook. So we've tried cooking classes. What else might we do? Well, this is the problem that the villagers in Malawi were facing, and they come up with a fantastic answer. The answer they come up with is called Recipe Day. Now, Recipe Day is when should we call someone? A Recipe Day is when a Recipe Day is where about 100 people are brought together, and they are women, men, and children, and they're brought together to trade recipes. Now, bear in mind, this is sorghum and millet and cowpea and soy. These are crops that everyone knows to be nutritious. No one has the first clue what to do with them. It's like kale. This is a kale problem, where it's like, I understand, but is there a way of eating this that doesn't make it taste completely bad? And of course, raw soybeans do taste completely. If you eat raw soybeans, you will get nothing from them except sort of sour taste and a lot of flatulence. You have to figure out ways of cooking. So people figure out these ways of cooking, and what happens is that these recipes are exchanged, but also it becomes a space of kind of radical equality, where everyone's knowledge is treated as equal, and that I think is tremendously important. This becomes a space in which there are no experts, where there's just the devils. There is sort of a flat hierarchy where women get to call out men on their sexism, and where what happens, what appears to be a domestic quarrel, actually ends up being a political one, and becomes much more resolvable. And similarly, mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, because of a range of colonial reasons, mothers-in-law think that their job is to advise daughters-in-law to stop breastfeeding at 2 months and feed their kids, their babies, oats and water. I can keep you entertained. I can tell my World Bank joke again. World Bank joke. Okay. Well, while we're waiting, those of you who are not aware, I used to work for the World Bank, and at some point hopefully they'll be able to hear it. So, World Bank. For those of you who do not know what the World Bank is, the World Bank is it's a multilateral lending institution that offers conditionalities and poverty reduction strategy papers, and essentially it's a way of controlling fiscal and monetary policy through a multi-year and often illegally incurred multi-year loan. But one of the best ways of understanding this is through the Terry Gilliam film Time Bandits. So if you haven't seen Time Bandits, who has seen Time Bandits? We've a show of hands, slightly older or smoking. If you haven't heard of Time Bandits, this is actually an important film for you to see. It's a Terry Gilliam film, sort of Monty Python and a group of people, and the idea in Time Bandits is that the universe was built in 6 days, so it's a rush job. So the universe has holes in it, and God had help, but he doesn't treat his workers very well. In one scene, these workers run off with a map of the holes in the universe, and they use it to rob people. And so in one scene, they rob Napoleon, they take all Napoleon's stuff, and they jump through a hole in the universe, and they end up in Sherwood Forest, where they are met by Robin Hood, who's played by John Cleese as an upper-class twit. He's introducing a long green hat, and he introduces himself as Hood. So Hood is very excited. He's very pleased to see all Napoleon's stuff. And he's well, thank you very much indeed. He didn't have feedback of it. Thank you very much indeed. This is terrific stuff. The poor will love this. Have you met the poor? They're charming people. Of course, they don't have 2 pennies to rub together because they're poor. And so there's a scene where Hood gives Napoleon's stuff to the poor. Oh, bring on the poor. So a line of the poor brought on. And so Hood works the line where, gilded mirror for you, yes, how do you do? Jolly good, well done. And rubies for you, yes, how long have you been poor? Jolly good. And then there's a bloke who takes whatever Hood has given and punches the poor person in the face. And that's how the World Bank works. So no, it's hard to. Here's this image of the World Bank of have you met the poor? The project I worked on at the World Bank is called Voices of the Poor. Can anyone hear us? Can anyone hear us? Can anyone? So the point being, we're just telling a story about the World Bank, and it's a thing. The point about the World Bank is that it is this institution that perpetuates the kind of structural adjustment policy that we were talking about earlier on, of getting the government to step back from its commitment to the poor. But it is also this sort of massive self-delusion engine. It's kind of Voices of the Poor, Can Anyone Hear Us is a book that essentially allows the World Bank to say, look, have you met the poor? We had lunch with them yesterday. They were terrific. So, enough about that. And back to Malawi. Were you there for the Malawi story over there in the other room? You were kind of there for the Malawi story. I apologize. Come over here later on, but we'll do it again. But the Malawi story is just, what it strikes me as important for is providing a space of radical equality. And this radical equality, completely different to the sort of top-down development policy of the World Bank or the Gates Foundation or Monsanto or what have you. What's important in Malawi is the fact that it's a flat hierarchy. And so even if you have daughters-in-law, mothers-in-law, which is a contentious relationship no matter what culture you're in, and the relationship between men and women, also a contentious relationship no matter where you are, wherever there is these asymmetries of power. I don't see myself out of this in any way. I mean, getting rid of my own patriarchy is a lifelong project, but it has to be done. And these spaces provide ways in which that project can be advanced in some really important ways. Because often we're told, these cultures are backward and it'll take them generations to move out of their patriarchy. But what's interesting is that men who join these recipe days then are found often doing crazy things like carrying water, which is absolutely a gender-coded female thing, and are getting more involved in the home, in child raising, and as a result, child nutrition goes up. But what we've also seen is that household income goes up, and there are now community credit circles in which men and women are equally figuring out where to distribute the resources. And this is a very different way of managing resources with radical equality than the model that we have with contemporary modern capitalism and the kind of development model that they've been pushing. Now, the reason I mention this is because this tiny story in a tiny village in Malawi sounds like it's not doing much of anything. It's like, we're teaching men how to cook. But no, we're fighting back against the food culture that has built us. If we're talking about cultures of sustainability, then that's what's happening right here. And it's a transformative space, not to sort of hanker after Coca-Cola or be a space in which we are marketed at, but rather this is a space in which we create our own desires and celebrate our own joy. And I think that's what makes this work. Yes, this is a space of radical equality, but it's a space where there is joy in social change. Because social change, I grew up in that part of the left where it's like if it didn't hurt, you weren't doing it right. Where the idea of social change always involved giving something up, and where people would mock you for your sort of self-abnegation and your hair shirtedness, but luckily you had the comforts of tofu. This is a model of social change and radical equality through joy. And I think that there's something important for any kind of progressive project that understands that equality and joy need to be together. And the kinds of social change we're seeing in the Generation Food Project always have this element of joy and community and equality always present. And I think if we're interested in cultures of sustainability for change, that has to be part of it. And also, this is also a project about challenging one of the most important asymmetries of power in the world. So the fact is, if we look at the people who are going hungry in the world today, 60% are women or girls. If we're interested in a project that transforms that number, that eradicates hunger, and certainly challenges the asymmetry of power that happens within the home, then here's a project that does that. And this is a massively important project. When we think about food sovereignty, about the idea that we need a democracy in our food system, food sovereignty means, one of the shorthands for food sovereignty is that food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women and girls. And that's not just the horrific violence, the gender-based violence that happens within the home. It's not just about the sexual violence that's been so tragically on the screens recently, but it's also about the structural violence of being unable to sell your product in a market because a multinational has dumped its product there, or because the US or the European Union is dumping its stuff at below the cost of production. That sort of big structural change is part of what this Malawian story offers. And I think that's what strikes me as perhaps most important is how this Malawian example came about. Which is that it was driven ultimately by farmer innovation, by the innovation and ideas of millions of these 5,000 farmers, not just a single expert. And that's a model for agriculture and a model for social change that I think is tremendously important. I think that that's an idea of transformative politics that takes the power out of the hands of the government, the corporation, or even the party, and redistributes it and puts it in everyone's hands. And if we're interested in agroecology for the future, a culture of agriculture, then that means distributing the knowledge of that. Not technology in a seed, but technology in the relationships that we have with one another. And that seems to me also a culture of sustainability and change. But that means that we need to take we need to be much more active, firstly in resisting the way that capitalism shapes us, but also in fighting back against, and being creative with the communities in which we find ourselves. But that's the joy and the challenge of sustainability. And that's a joy and a challenge that I'm really looking forward to talking about and working with you on, because we can be idle no more. Thanks very much. I have no idea how I'm going to do the Q&A with other people. Hello over there again. But we have a couple of mics and we're going to line up.
Yeah, so we probably have about 20 or 25 minutes for questions, and Carly has a mic there, and Lauren has a mic here as well. So if you have a question, raise your hand. One of them will come to you, and maybe we'll do 2 in this room and then 1 from the other room. Do you think that sounds like a good idea?
Yeah, I've got the other room.
And Trina's she's text message from the other room is going to be getting the questions from them. So she'll read those aloud when they come up. So please, any questions?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, so who'd like to start?
Set up. Yes. Hello. I'm going to pull a bar samyan on you. So if you could talk about for us the numbers that Arundhati Roy and Vandana Shiva mentioned for the farmers in India, and they're looking at approximately 300,000 of the suicides. They also talk about the memorandums of understanding and how Coca-Cola in particular is stealing water basically for free from the water table for the already starved areas, and how that's affecting everything going on in there, including the indigenous populations that they're trying to displace for all that.
So the story in India is fairly dire if you're a farmer. And the rates of suicide are about 1 every 30 minutes for farmers in India. Now, oddly, for a population that big, that number could be higher. But what we've noticed is that as a result of liberalization in the economy, the story about farmer suicides is often the same, where a farmer will borrow money in order to participate in the sort of agricultural revolution, whether it's about genetically modified cotton or even just improved seed. It doesn't have to be about genetic modification at all. So it's not only about the GMOs. And in fact, most farmers don't grow GMOs, but most farmers who are involved in farmer suicides are growing conventional crops or hybrid crops for which they've been seen. But they are always in debt. And the debt that is incurred, as I say, it used to be that you could borrow money from one government agency and then another would buy the crop, and then agricultural extensive services would be available somewhere else. All of that was shrunk back because of this economic liberalization. And so then it became the village moneylender was also the farm, the seed supplier was also the middleman when it came time to sell your crop. And in that story, with that concentration of power, farmer suicides have gone up. But I think it's important, while it's important to recognize that this is going on in India, it's also important to recognize that that story of debt is a global story. And you can find that story in Canada, you can find that story in the United States, you can certainly find that story in the United Kingdom and Australia. And it's always the same kind of story of individuals who are buying seeds, who are investing in their farms, who get heavily into debt, and then face the prospect of losing not just their farms, but their identities. And so rather than face the oblivion of losing your name, your place in the world, some farmers have chosen to take their own lives. But there's also systematic underreporting there, because in every culture, suicide is so shameful that those numbers are underreported by some estimates by about 25%. So those, for farmers in India involved in conventional agriculture, the story's not good. And that's why it was interesting to hear the head of agricultural science in Punjab whose job it is to push these green revolution technologies of fertilizer and pesticide, say that 70% of India's farmers should be organic. This is the government, the guy employed by the government to make everyone not organic, says 70% of India's farmers should be organic. And that seems to me an indictment of the way that the agriculture is working in India at the moment. But it's also, you know, I mean, the reason for India's hunger is not just about farming, it's also, I mean, not just about green revolution crops. But people forget that the green revolution was also about paying higher prices for food. These days, you know, when you think of the new green revolution that's being peddled, it's always about Monsanto saying, well, we have engineered this particular seed and it's going to be fabulous. You know, you're going to be able to grow all kinds of things. It's like sort of magic beanstalk theory of agriculture. And yet, of course, I mean, the magic beanstalk is a funny, good childhood story because it's about one seed doing all the stuff. But in reality, no one seed does anything. You need society to be able to make the seeds matter. So in the Malawi story, it's about the sort of decentralized agriculture and agricultural knowledge. Yes, the seeds matter, but there's an exchange of them. The model of agriculture that's being pushed by the Indian government is absolutely about a single seed and removing the price supports that were always part of the original green revolution. So I think that story in India is also a fairly dire one. And of course, as you say, Coca-Cola has, and Pepsi as well, been pumping away groundwater and been using groundwater that is important for farmers to be able to access, and they've been able to do that, pretty much scot-free. But it's not just Indian, it's not just Coke and Pepsi that are doing that. Again, the biggest criminals here, though of course they're never prosecuted, are the large industrial concerns that use vast amounts of water that's meant to be used for irrigation. And so, what's the solution? Again, clearly stopping the kind of theft of water is tremendously important. But again, moving away from the kind of irrigated agriculture that the Green Revolution brought in is also important, because India is doing very little about climate change. It's doing very little about the fact that the glaciers on which the main rivers in India depend are melting away, and within a generation or two, they will be gone. And that's going to be a catastrophe for Indian agriculture. Moving away to kinds of agriculture that are more robust and resilient to those kinds of drought are tremendously important. Now, stopping the theft of water by large corporations, domestic and foreign, is important. But actually, we need much bigger change now, because we're starting to move towards a system of a system of agriculture so deeply affected by climate change that returning to wishful thinking of sort of we'll irrigate our way out of this will never be able to help.
Can you just ask them if they can hear the question?
Yes.
Oh yes.
They can hear the
Can you hear the
question.
question?
Can they hear when the question's asked?
Can you hear when the question's asked over there?
Yes? Okay, perfect. So we have another question. Lauren with the mic there. And do you have a question for Trina? And then Carly, can you come on down here for one from the other room? The next. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. My question is particularly about the city of Edmonton, and I really appreciate your stories about Italy and Malawi and how their food cultures and their citizens really take action to transform their food system. The city of Edmonton, over the past 2 years or so, has been creating this food strategy, and citizens and just want to recognize that Edmonton has a lot of food culture, so all of the slow food and you talked about are definitely present. But one of the biggest factors that I personally have seen is that there is, on the policy side of things, lack of recognition on the importance of preserving farmland, particularly in Edmonton, which is very rich in fertile soils. So I just wondered if, from your experience, you have recommendations from other cities or countries even that have been dealing with a similar situation. How do citizens go about protecting that and kind of changing that policy model?
Thanks so much. That's a terrific question. Yes, Edmonton, the year-round farmers market to me seems an exercise in pure bravery. It's the only farmers market where you can buy your frozen vegetables. But I appreciate that actually that there is a food policy council being formed at the moment, and I think that's a terrific idea. But there's, part of, as you say, part of the issue here is town planning, and Edmonton may be blessed with many things, but wise town planners was not among them, as far as I can tell. The structure of town, an interesting exhibit here is Portland. which has kinds of zoning that are that encourage dense urban build-up and well-planned towns, but then also have green spaces systematically built into them. It's not too late to do, it's never too late to embark on that kind of a vision for town planning, as long as it's sort of wholeheartedly endorsed by everyone. But what's interesting about that is that if we're thinking about cities of the future that are able to feed themselves, then I commend to you a report that addresses some of these issues, and the report is the breathtakingly named International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development, the IAASTD. So this is a report done by 450 of the world's top scientists, none of whom seems to have been able to do an acronym. These scientists were urged only by the World Bank and by the US and the Canadian and the British and a range of other governments to answer the question, how will we eat in 2050 when there are 8 billion people? How are we going to feed the world in 2050? And so the answer, they said, is we'll need more urban and peri-urban agriculture. And that means, and the reason we need peri-urban and urban agriculture, I think, is straightforward. We need to move away from the kind of fossil fuel intensive agriculture that we have at the moment, on which Canada obviously in which Canada excels, but sadly to the detriment of everyone else. And so then it means moving away from that kind of agriculture to an agriculture that's much more sustainable and local and zero carbon. But in order to do that, you need spaces to be able to grow food. There are some incredibly important and inventive ways in which that can happen. I mean, Havana is an interesting example of a city that, by force, has had to switch its agricultural production to be agroecological, so now 70% of the vegetables eaten in Havana come from Havana. Though interestingly, that's been endangered by socialism. Well, not by socialism, but by Hugo Chavez, because the dividend here is. I think I'm a fan of socialism. I think that what we have is a sort of a perverse, sort of pre-climate change socialism, if you like. The kind of socialism that where Cuba is sending doctors to Venezuela, and Venezuela in return is sending fossil fuel. And so the fossil fuel is getting turned into fertilizer, and so Cuba is now, from a position of being a country where fossil fuel is not available, so they invented these fantastic kinds of urban agriculture, is becoming easier to slip back into high fossil fuel, high carbon agriculture. Just sort of a word to the wise there, that although there are some incredibly interesting things happening in Cuba in terms of urban agroecology, there's also some fairly worrying things. But I think what's also interesting about Cuba is that they take very seriously something that often drops out of the equation, which is entitlement. So if you go to Havana, you may see people who are overweight, but you don't see anyone who's starving. You don't see anyone who's, although there is poverty, you don't see anyone who's going hungry. And that's important. Understanding as part of an urban food system that what you need to do is feed everyone, and to make sure that everyone has access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Access doesn't mean having it there, it means being able to afford it. Now, addressing those kinds of issues is tremendously important, and the cities that get that right are few and far between. But certainly, cities that pay attention to equity, pay attention not just to making the farmland available on the farmers markets and what have you, but also pay attention to things like Meals on Wheels services, to make sure farm-to-table Meals on Wheels services, which Oakland has been experimenting with some success. And entitlement services that mean that if you are at a food bank, you are getting healthy, nutritious food, which Salem in Oregon is doing amazing work with. So these kind of, and of course, you have organizations in Canada like The Stop, which is in Toronto, and there's a food bank and a community food center that wants to put a food bank that wants to put itself out of business. That sort of an approach to urban, to urban farming and urban food systems seems to me an incredibly good one. And I think that those kinds of models where they are using urban land, but they partner with the government, and they've also tried to make a planning case for why in the future this would be a good idea. But when you have examples like Oakland, Portland, Havana, and bits of Toronto, there's enough there to be able, sort of best case, best practices that I think might be useful in persuading town planners here to act wisely.
Okay, we have a question from the other room here. This
This question's from Anna. Anna, can you give us a wave over there? Who's Anna?
Everyone wave to Anna, please.
Anyways, she first says thank you for the entertaining and informative talk, and she wants some concrete actions, and she said in brackets, please nothing not ethical consumerism, so something beyond just not buying faster beans, that we as Albertans can take to create structural change.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot in terms of the international level that I can speak to, and the idea, what's important, it seems to me, is removing agriculture from the World Trade Organization. And so, I mean, a lot of the harm that is happening internationally is happening because our governments let it. And that means the Canadian government, the US government, the British government, the European government. So actively engaging with our governments to forgive debt, to stop climate change, and to stop the tar sand project, for example, to take aggressive action against climate change here, because actually that's what farmers in the global south are facing. So I mean, it's kind of convenient if you want to do stuff around the food system. Taking on climate change and moving towards a zero carbon economy as soon as possible is a great thing to be doing. But when it comes to things that can happen locally and regionally, I mean, I'm in no position to say what that is, and that's the right thing. I mean, if we're serious about food sovereignty, then food sovereignty is about communities taking decisions by themselves. And that was the whole vision of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty was invented by La Via Campesina, so that different groups from around the world could figure out by themselves, after having addressed the sort of bare minimum of remove agriculture from the World Trade Organization, respect women's rights, and respect countries' and states' abilities to feed themselves. Beyond that, it's up to everyone to figure out by themselves. So you're not going to like me for this, but I think that the onus is to actually get together and foment that policy together. But here's where I can be useful, because there are groups that, because often it's hard to, someone says, well, you should come up with your own policy. Screw you, do it yourself. And that can feel a little unhelpful. So, I mean, there are groups that have taken it upon themselves to do things like this. And there's a group in Detroit called Cook, Eat, Talk. So here's what they do. They cook, and then they eat, and then they talk about what it is that they would like to happen in their communities around the food system. And what's important about that, first of all, is that, again, it has that joy component. Right? It's not about some dude telling you what to do. But it has that moment of joy and of equality and of people sharing food together. And also having tough political conversations in a way that feels safe. And these groups happen, and they've been developing to be able to address issues in Detroit and around, and in Michigan, around access to land and access to education and employment. But these groups work very well in terms of being able to propel a policy discussion forward. And luckily, I mean, right here, Edmonton's in the process of developing a food policy council, which is a fantastic place to be able to start engaging in issues around, around food and food politics. Now, I have my own hobby horses that I think are important. Getting agriculture out of the World Trade Organization. I also think that. Banning marketing of food to kids is important. I mean, so for example, one of the things that we do in San Francisco, one of the things I've been involved in San Francisco is with colleagues there to remove toys from Happy Meals. I mean, not one at a time, but but as a matter of policy, in the national press, we were called murderers of fun. Our website is Down with the Clown. But it's important, right? I mean, one of the ways in which it seems to me that we can push back against the power of large corporations on our daily lives is to stop giving them our kids. And to, again, remember, this idea of how capitalism has constructed us into thinking that certain foods are normal, that doesn't happen by magic, it happens every day through work. And that, one of the ways that happens is through the marketing that fast food companies do. So for me, what's important is to be able to not give our kids, I can spend all the time I like trying to get my son to eat kale. And then get him taken care of, and then all of a sudden he goes to school, or he's just in a public space, and he's parented by a clown. Because that's essentially what's happening when every dollar that's spent promoting something that's good for you is counted with $500 of junk food advertising globally. So for me, one of the struggles that's important in my community is to stop handing children over to companies. And that means fighting the marketing of everything to children, not just food. Because, think about marketing. The economic case for marketing, in economics, marketing is considered information. And you give information to your rational consumer, and the consumer will be like, oh, I choose Diet Coke Light Cherry Plus, as opposed to Diet Pepsi Light Cherry Minus, or whatever it is. This is information. But the thing is, of course, children are not rational consumers. I think we're all pretty much agreed that children shouldn't be given alcohol, they shouldn't be allowed to drive, and they oughtn't to be allowed guns unless they live in America. We have this idea that they are minors, that they are not rational, and they shouldn't be. And so then the case for marketing to children disappears. There's no good reason to market to them. In fact, there's every bad reason. And so the American Psychological Association, the Pediatric Association, have been saying end junk food marketing to kids. And I think that that's a good idea. So for me, in my community, that's one of the things that we came up with as a longer-term structural change, as well as, but it depends on the community and it depends on the kind of change. But ultimately, that change has to be sort of big. One of the reasons, I'm taking a step back here, one of the reasons why we're calling generation food is because often when we're thinking about how to change the world, we're encouraged not to think generationally, but at the checkout, in the smallest fraction possible of time. And when you're thinking about time in this very narrow way, then the number of choices you have becomes quite small, right? You get to choose between Coke or Pepsi. If the horizon of your choices and freedoms is about what you do in the next 5 minutes, there's not a whole lot you can do. But if you start to think generationally, then all of a sudden everything becomes possible. If you start to think big picture, if you start to think about not tomorrow, but a generation from now, then all the things that look like constraints all of a sudden become much more permeable. They don't have to be that way. The way we farm, the way we market, the way we grow food, the way we share food, all of that is now up for grabs. And that's what, that kind of generational thinking is what I would encourage much more. Good, it's huge. I think, when we have these cookie talk discussions, thinking generationally rather than thinking about what happens next month or next year means that our ideas will be much bigger and the solutions will be much more radical. But that means that, it's that kind of thinking that's going to get us out of the muck we're in at the moment rather than fiddling on the edges of, as you say, ethical consumers.
Okay, so Lauren has the mic over here.
Hey everybody, I'm Vernon. I'm part of I Don't Know What. I have two things to say. First, about the World Trade and about the World Bank. The World Bank gets people to borrow money, and then they raise it to so high that you can't pay it back. Second thing I have to say is there's arsenic all over the place. When the oil companies heat up the ground, they turn this regular arsenic into deadly poison. Now, how are we supposed to grow good food when the ground is all poison?
That would be a rhetorical question, I think, because I think one of the ways to combat that scourge is to fight with all our might to keep the oil in the ground. There are mechanisms for soil remediation, but nothing. The titanic destruction that the tar sands is causing is something that is a generational problem, and I think that's something to be fought with all our might.
But I have no more to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Nikki. I just first wanted to say thank you so much for speaking. I am absolutely in awe of the fact that you filled this room. I don't even think I've had a class in here that has been full. Thank you very much for coming over to me today.
Thank you. That's a reflection on y'all.
or any kind of consumer choice, really. And I've recently become very interested in how consumers try to make a change, but are really met with a roadblock in a lot of ways. For the most part, we're forced to shop at a grocery store most of the time. We can try to supplement shopping at the farmer's market, but due to seasonal constraints, budgetary constraints, whatever, we're still at the grocery store, we're still walking in, and I believe we're being fooled a lot of times. You mentioned that marketing is supposed to be a matter of communication, but I would argue that it is much more a method of trying to get us to buy something, like you had mentioned. It is nothing about educating the consumer. So once you leave the grocery store, you're actually usually less educated about the items you're buying than perhaps when you walked in. For example, the fair trade. You buy fair trade because it's better than not buying fair trade, but you really don't understand what is the mechanisms behind it. Is it a better choice? You buy organic, you're not actually guaranteed that it's going to be a better choice for the environment, but you know that they perhaps didn't use pesticides, but perhaps the carbon footprint is actually higher because of the processes to actually keep the food fresh. So there's a whole bunch of really confusing things for consumers, and I feel like we're fighting a system that has to change. Like the very first things that has to change is how we're actually being communicated around food. And I guess my question is, do you have any ideas of how you change that marketing front? Is it going to be a government thing, or is it like I really don't know. I've been trying to think about this, and I have no idea how do you make it easier for consumers to actually make the choices they want to make.
Thank you. It's an important question because our relationship to food has become so attenuated that we rely on labels to be able to give us the kinds of insight about the provenance of food. And of course, the trouble with that is that means that our window into our food is reduced to something the size of a postage stamp, right? That our relationship is mediated by, it has half a dozen different symbols on it. And I have friends who've been reduced to tears in the supermarket aisle because you're like, oh fuck, well, is that a good thing? It's high polyunsaturated, no, I have no idea. But part of this is, of course, is conscious effort on the part of food companies to be able to prey on our ideas of doing the right thing, to be able to greenwash their products. There's a hilarious new development in food marketing is to say trans fat free. And you've got like, how did the trans fats get in there in the first place? And of course, it was the same food industry that was, that insisted on giving you trans fats is now making a virtue of pulling them out again. It's like, the old sort of vacuum cleaner salesman who comes and just dumps a ton of crap on your carpet and hoovers most of it up, but leaves some of it there. But still makes a virtue of most of it's gone. It's okay. So it seems to me that the way to address the marketing problem and the way in which we are infantilized by these labels. That actually our relationship to food has become much less sophisticated, even though you now need a degree in advanced nutrition to actually understand what's going on, and then and a degree in advanced biochemistry to actually understand what the ingredients are. One of the ways around that is to think outside the label and beyond the supermarket, beyond those kinds of social interactions to understand our food. So if we were to move away from labels altogether, away from these tiny little things being the guides to what we eat, to something different, what would that look like? Well, first of all, we need to be much more steeped in a food culture. And this is what's nice about your question, is it brings us back to this idea of a culture of sustainability, a culture for sustainability. That culture would be much more one in which we got to learn in which we understood how food was grown, and where it was grown, and the conditions of its, through which it was grown, and knew that workers were being well treated. Now, the way in which we make sure workers are well treated, there's a certain amount of cachet that comes from a fair trade label. But actually, again, the bizarre thing is that most food is not about fair treatment for workers. We need to change the rules of the global trade system in order to make sure that no worker gets to be exploited in the process of food being produced. We don't do that through a label mechanism, we do that through political agitation. And we don't get to have a better food culture by just having bigger and bigger labels, so we can just go into the supermarket with our magnifying glasses and just study every package. but rather that we should actually spend more time learning how to cook. And so I'm part of a group called Cook. I'm part of a group in San Francisco called the Edible Schoolyard. The Edible Schoolyard has, again, sort of reputation as being a kind of middle class, teaching kids how to cook. But the Edible Schoolyard that I'm in is in the poorest area of San Francisco, where in fact the soil is a Superfund site. It was contaminated by a range of PCBs, and the soil cannot be grown on for generations. So instead, they've got these soil, what they call the buckets, the raised beds. Anyway, so they have the raised beds, and they're sort of protected from the poison soil beneath. And kids learn how to cook. Well, first they learn how to grow things. And so they learn the arts of tending plants and of growing what grows in season. Then they learn how to harvest. Then they learn how to cook. And then they learn how to get around the table and talk. And and for a lot of kids, that's also a new skill. In San Francisco, this is a Berkeley organization, so we use some of their conversational starter cards, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or why is there racism in the world today? Berkeley conversation starters. But these are important skills that are all part of that arc of marketing, right? Instead of having the marketing where we reduce our food conversations to organic, we actually have a much deeper and richer experience of understanding the provenance of food and where it's from, what kind of variety and how it's grown. And that sort of culture starts, matters young, but you're never too late to start. I mean, I grew up eating a whole ton of crap. And it's only been relatively recently that I've started growing my own food and understanding more about where it comes from, and weaning myself off a lifetime of incredibly bad food choices. The kinds of food choices that are killing my family back in Britain. My family, I mean, my background is that my family work in convenience stores. It's surrounded by Coke and Pepsi and the high fructose corn syrup and sugary, salty, fatty snacks. And everyone over 50, or every man over 50 in my family has diabetes. And there's blindness, there's amputation, there's premature death, there's heart disease, there's all that sort of stuff. But I'm trying to avoid that, and I think for me it's kind of that transformation hasn't been easy. But it can get. I mean, if I can do it, I'm kind of like it doesn't get much more in. Like for my 8th birthday, my birthday cake was a hamburger because I just love them so much. And so to be so saturated in the food system, and if I can make it out, pretty much anyone can. So I think that having those cultures around which food matters, but matters joyfully, and where we actually understand what organic actually means, what dignified labor involves. That means political change and addressing capitalism, but it also means a culture of joy and sensuality that we've also been denied by our food system. And who doesn't want joy and sensuality?
Okay, so this question is from Janessa. Can you wave at us, Janessa, or stand up? Hi. Okay, so she says, I'm just wondering if you think it's important for people to eat less meat or go vegetarian because of the amount of food it takes to grow beef when those grains could be used to feed malnourished people instead.
Thank you, Janessa. I do think that it's important for us to eat no meat, or if you're going to eat meat, eat less, but enjoy it more. I choose not to, though. Occasionally, when we've been filming Generation Food, I was in Peru, and we were given alpaca tartare, so raw alpaca, and it is the nicest thing I've ever eaten. It would have been rude to refuse it, so I ate it. There are circumstances in which eating meat, I have done it, and I'll live with that karma. But in general, eating meat, particularly meat from the industrial food system, doesn't do anyone any good, as people in Alberta will well know. The kind of, and of course, here's the odd thing. I was talking about this earlier on today. But in the United States, there are 13 states apparently where I cannot say that eating meat is bad for your health because of ag-gag laws. In the United States, there are these you may remember that Oprah was sued for disparaging meat because she said, burgers are a bit dodgy and she wasn't a big fan of them. But by saying that she had suspicions about the quality of meat from the industrial food system, she was breaking the law because they said that in the United States there are food disparagement laws that operate on the same principle that you shouldn't be allowed to say fire in a crowded theatre. Because if you say fire in a crowded theatre, everyone jabs you into disaster. So in the United States, you're not allowed to say the industrial food system is poisoning us. Because of meat, for example. Because that would be to disparage it, to sow fear and discord among people who are perfectly happy eating contaminated food. So, this is absolutely absurd. But this gets to the idea of, firstly, it's important to be able to talk about meat in a way that is rational and fair. And that ability is being taken away, certainly in the United States, by a very powerful meat industry. And the trouble is that the global meat industry is becoming more powerful because of the dietary transition in previously poor countries that are now becoming rich countries. So China, for example, though China is not the only country, and when I say China, there are people in China who are still incredibly poor and exploited in just the same way as farmers everywhere else. But the Chinese government is acting to be able to boost the consumption of pork of its middle class. And so that means buying soy. And that means buying soy from one of the world's largest soy exporters, which means buying soy from Brazil, which means increasing pressure on the rainforest and destroying the Amazon. And so we have a huge kind of environmental problem associated with global meat consumption. On top of that, as you say, this meat has an opportunity cost. And that opportunity cost is the land that that is being used for animal feed that could be used for grains for human consumption. For a vegetarian diet. So I absolutely think that if we are to feed everyone, we do need to be eating less meat. But there are loads of reasons why eating less meat is a good idea. It means that there's the Epicurean version, which is that the meat we eat today is just the most barbaric stuff. And again, it takes a lot of work to make us think that this meat is normal. Jamie Oliver, right? Jamie Oliver is a celebrity chef. He had this celebrity cooking show. It's called Jamie's School Dinners in the United Kingdom and Jamie's Food Revolutions in the United States. And he did this trick where he took school kids and he showed them some of their favorite meat product. In Britain, it's called turkey Twizzlers, and in the US, it's chicken nuggets, right? And so he sort of deconstructs them. And he goes, "Kids, do you like these Twizzlers, stroke nuggets?" And so in Britain, and in the US, they're like, "Yeah, we love it, yay!" Nuggets, Twizzlers. And so then he goes, "Right, kids, I'm going to show you how to make it." So he takes, it's like, right, eyeballs, testicles, mechanically recovered meat, sort of eye of newt, and then he blends it up, and then it turns into this big pink, like slurry foam thing. It's really gross. And the kids in both countries are like, "Oh God, that's horrible! Oh no!" And then he deep fries them and he gives them. It's like, "Go on then, kids, do you want this?" And the British kids go, "No, I'm not going to eat that." And in America they go, "Yeah, all right." And I think the moral of that story is that actually, it takes a lot for us emotionally to disconnect from that. But it takes a lot of marketing to make something that a second ago you found repellent into something that is something that's considered palatable. The anthropologist Levi-Strauss said that before something can be nice to eat, it has to be nice to think about. And a lot of work has gone into making our modern meat nice to think about. And that's what these anti-meat disparagement laws do, is to stop us thinking bad things about something that is bad. So I certainly think that from an Epicurean perspective, if you want good meat, then you should have good meat and not this pink stuff. But you need to be able to be free to think that. But actually be free also then to think about the opportunity cost of the grain that is going into there that actually can go into other places. The grain that because you are demanding meat is being diverted from the bowls of people who can only afford grain. There are food systems where meat does feature and can feature sustainably, but they are few and far between, and most of us are lucky to be able to have meat from that kind of food system once a month. which brings us back to a food system that we used, that humanity used to live in, 300 years ago. So the fact that we have meat every day is weird and strange, and it's okay not to get used to that. It's okay to be able to pluck ourselves out of that. And again, think much more about eating sustainably. I mean, not to say that there's anything wonderful about or automatically pure sort of halo-inducing about being vegetarian. I mean, if you're eating tofu that comes from Brazil, you're destroying the rainforest no less than if that tofu was, that soy was fed to a chicken for a few days and then popped out feathers, and then you have that chicken as a nugget. In Brazil, they call chicken soy with feathers. So it's important to understand, that if one's going down this route of vegetarianism is sustainable, that actually we think more deeply about that footprint. But nonetheless, I think that there are very good arguments to move away from meat. And certainly, even if you're not attracted to vegetarian food, and that's likely because you haven't had joyful, good vegetarian food. But even if you don't care about that, if you like meat, then you should like it more, and you should be nicer to yourself than allowing yourself to eat that stuff. It's just not good.
Well, that brings us to the end of the evening. First of all, on behalf of the Office of Sustainability, International Week, and the City of Edmonton, a huge thank you all for joining us tonight on such a cool night. A huge thank you to the other room for coming and sticking around. And then, of course, a massive and enthusiastic thank you for an incredible talk that has left us all with lots to think about, lots of inspiration, ideas, and another person who braved -38 degree weather to join us here.